That's a good sign that you're still here. What I'd like to do now is take some of the principles and presuppositions that I mentioned in the first lecture and try to apply it a bit to a particular passage of portions of Scripture that we call narrative. Narratives are, of course, the fancy professor word for story. We're going to look at the different stories of the Bible. And how do we preach the Bible stories without just repeating the story with some unique little add-ons, and then at the very end go, and then the moral of the lesson is, be like David and have more courage. And again, it could be a lot worse than that. I've heard a lot worse sermons than that. But there must be more than these be like David, or be like Daniel, or don't be like David, or don't be like Daniel, depending on the circumstance. And so how do we preach Old Testament stories, doing justice to the intention of the author, the human author, but also doing justice to the divine author in terms of the gospel, but then at the same time, apply it to the hearts and lives of the people that we're standing in front of when we preach and teach. First of all, let me say, it's a very humbling task, isn't it? It's not easy to do this. And yet, what a wonderful privilege. Think about it. What can be greater in this life than to give words of life to people? How many other jobs can you have where on your resume you can actually put down as one of your skill sets, I'm involved in resurrection from the dead. I help raise people from the dead. You may want to hire me. Think about it. As those who proclaim the gospel of life, dead people come to life. Hallelujah? Hallelujah. So again, what a wonderful privilege it is to be a herald of the King. To be able to present the message of peace, hope, and life eternal to dead people and have them come to life. And to have life with meaning and purpose. A life often filled with so many tragedies and temptations and tribulations. You give them the gospel, you give them Jesus, week in and week out. And so yes, it's a wonderful privilege, but it's also a terrible, oftentimes scary responsibility, isn't it? And I don't know where all of you are, whether you're preachers or teachers or counselors, mothers, fathers, friends. Every one of us needs to learn how to do this better. God has given us this wonderful privilege to not only be His sons and daughters, but also His servants to share the gospel. And so whether it's sharing the gospel with our neighbors or preaching it from the pulpit at First Presbyterian Church in Augusta, Georgia, we all need to learn how to do this better. And so part of my task in this next hour is to share some of what I've been learning about the unique elements of what we call Hebrew narrative or Hebrew stories. Stories are wonderful, aren't they? We all love a good yarn, as they say. We all love a good story. And I don't know if you know, but there's a recent wave, we call it the wave of popularity of Korean dramas. Has anyone ever gotten into this, Korean dramas? It's all over. It's an international sensation, even in the Philippines, right? Korean dramas are very popular, you know? And unfortunately, I also watch them too. You know, it's a typical kind of storyline. You know, good girl meets the good boy, falls in love, but in comes the bad boy. And she starts to be interested in bad boy, creating tension, conflict. Well, how is this going to resolve? Then there's like 18 episodes just trying to figure out all the complications of the relationships, the in-laws, friends, job, and you're just hooked. And you cannot stop watching, you know. It's like, you know, these Netflix shows that we watch, like Mad Men, right? These great stories. What is it about stories that so appeal to us? I think they appeal to us because God designed us that way. Stories are incredible. Stories have certain power and poignancy, I think, because it not only touches our minds, but also touches our hearts, doesn't it? Good stories stimulate the way we think about our world and our place in it, but also stir our souls. They stimulate and they stir, don't they? So stories are very powerful. But stories are also very effective because they make abstract ideas much more concrete, don't they? For example, Jesus could have easily said, love your neighbor, even the ones that you don't like. Instead, He says, Suppose there was this man who was beaten up on the side of the road, a Jewish man, and a rabbi comes and he passes him along the other side, doesn't care about him. But along comes a Samaritan. And in that time and place, Samaritans were the marginalized, excluded from the Jews. The Jews had nothing to do with these dirty half-breeds, these muggles, mudbloods as they call it in Harry Potter language. And the Samaritans were the mudbloods. So they were looked down upon. And so Jesus tells a story about a mudblood coming and helping a pureblood wizard when no other wizard wanted to help. All the Slytherin didn't want to help. See, now you're laughing because I'm connecting. But that's what Jesus does. Jesus uses a story to make abstract ideas concrete, vivid, not only to teach you something in your head, but ultimately to stir your heart so that your hands would do something about it. No wonder then that 60% of the Bible is story. God designed us a certain way as holistic beings. Beings to not only understand, but to feel. And so God presents His truth in ways that are beautiful, that not only stimulate the mind, but also stir the soul. And so part of our task as heralds is to pay careful attention to the way God designed these stories. And then show the purpose of these stories so that we can preach it and teach it not only more faithfully, but also more beautifully. And so that's part of my goal today, is to share with you some of the unique features. So what are some of the unique literary features of Old Testament narrative, and then give you some strategies to preach them. All right? And what we'll do is, since we mentioned Exodus 17 providentially, it's a great story, we'll use that as a kind of a case study, as an Old Testament story of what I would do with that text and how I would preach it and teach it. Does that sound reasonable? So that's the goal for the next, I hope, 45 minutes, Mike. Stop me if I go longer than that. That's really my goal, 45 minutes. All right? So bear with me. So, okay. So what are some features of Old Testament stories that you need to be aware of as heralds who want to be faithful to the text, but also faithful to the gospel as you communicate it? There are four main features of Old Testament narrative texts that are important for interpretation and communication. All right, ready? People, plot, places, and particulars. Yes, I am a Presbyterian minister. People, plot, places, and particulars. All right, those four things. Those are four features we need to be aware of. Now, mind you, as I share these things with you in a 45-minute session, I'm really just scratching the surface. There are a lot of resources out there that may be of help to you in knowing more about Hebrew narrative art and structure. One of the best one-volume books on biblical narratives is by Robert Alter, A-L-T-E-R. He's actually a Jewish scholar. I don't believe he's a Christian, but he understands Hebrew narratives really well. So while he doesn't write from a Christian perspective, he does give you a lot of insights into the way Jewish literature and Hebrew narratives are put together. It's called The Art of Biblical Narrative. Robert Alter, The Art of Biblical Narrative. There are some other books on narrative that may be of help to you. Richard Pratt has a wonderful book. Richard Pratt is a former professor at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando. I think it's called He Gave Us Stories. Richard Pratt, He Gave Us Stories, is another great book on narrative. So those are just specifically on narratives, and more about preaching narratives. Let's say not only understanding it, but then preaching it. Some great books on narratives. Sidney Greidanis, Modern Preacher and the Ancient Text. He has a section on narrative as well as other literary genres like poetry, prophecy, etc. So Sidney Greidanis, The Modern Preacher and the Ancient Text. Then Graham Goldsworthy. Graham is G-R-A-E-M-E. He's an Australian. Graham Goldsworthy, Preaching the Whole Bible as Christian Scripture. Preaching the Whole Bible as Christian Scripture. So here are some books that may be of help. And again, if I can be just a little self-serving, would that be all right, Mike? Just a little bit. My book is going to come out this fall, Lord willing. You're getting an advanced preview of some of what I've been researching and thinking about and writing. And so I have a book called Preaching the Whole Counsel of God, in which I talk about kind of soup to nuts. When you have a text, then how do you go preach it in a way that's faithful to all the things that I've been talking about. And in fact, one of the chapters I'll also talk about after lunch on the implications of neuroscience to the design and delivery of sermons. And so you'll get some advanced preview of a book that, Lord willing, will come out this fall through Zondervan. So Zondervan, Lord willing, will be publishing that. We're still in the editing process. They haven't given the final stamp of approval, so they can still pull the plug. So let's pray that they'll give the stamp of approval, and it'll come out this fall. And so that's Julius Kim at Preaching the Whole Counsel of God. I know the author. I can probably get you a discount, so let me know. Tell Mike and Pastor George, let these pastors know, and perhaps we can work out a deal for those who come to these conferences. Discounts are good. All right, 4 features. First, people. One of the things you have to examine and analyze when you approach an Old Testament narrative are the people in the narrative, or what we would call the characters in the story. What types of people are found in biblical narrative texts, and why are they important? Most of the characters that we find in Hebrew narrative or Old Testament narrative are typically human, divine, or demonic. The characters are in those primary human, divine, or demonic. Sometimes in Hebrew narrative, we have other species like animals, right? Like the serpent in Genesis, the donkey that approached Balaam. And once in a while, you have characters like that exhibit supernatural, personal characteristics like speech, emotion, will, purpose. And whenever these characters are found, you have to look at them a certain way. First, try to determine which character in the story is the primary protagonist. We call it the protagonist, right? The primary character involved in the main conflict of the plot, right? So most stories work in Hebrew literature a certain way. And I'll explain this more when I get into plot, the second point. But most Hebrew narratives work like a lot of narratives. They call it the narrative arc. A narrative arc works with most stories begin giving you some sort of introduction where everything's all okay. Everything's at peace, but then a conflict is introduced. That rises the tension. The tension in the story emerges. There's a climax. There's a climax to the story. Then there's resolution to that story. And then there's peace again. Okay? That is called the narrative arc. If you take any creative writing classes where you're taught how to write fiction, essentially you learn this narrative arc. And interestingly, that's been around for millennia, including the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible, many of the stories, if not all, work with this kind of structure. The primary protagonist is the one involved in this plot. Think, for example, of Frodo and the ring in J.R.R. Tolkien. He's the primary character in solving this problem of the ring. So he goes on this journey, he goes on this quest to figure it out. And as you know, if you know Tolkien's story, Lord of the Rings, there's a climax and resolution, right? Everything's all hunky-dory in the Shire. I mean, they eat 3 breakfasts, for goodness sake. It's all good. But then conflict is introduced, the ring, the problem of the ring and what that ring represents. And then there's this upward motion of trying to figure it out, and along the way there's all these other complications and issues. You have to find who's the primary character in the story. Now, having said that, you might think to yourself, well, Julius, you just said that God is the primary character in the Bible. Of course. He's the primary author and the primary character of salvation, and yet when he brings story, he's telling about himself and about you through this vehicle of story. And so when you examine this vehicle of him extolling truth, you have to figure out who the primary character is. The main action of resolving the conflict will involve this so-called hero figure. Now, mind you, being the protagonist or the hero figure does not necessarily mean that he is a character with positive, spiritual, or moral qualities. In the estimation of the inspired narrator, the narrator is often omniscient, in the narrator's eyes, this is usually a character with mixed motives. Not necessarily somebody who's perfect. Sometimes it's even evil. An evil person is the main character that has to go through this drama. So just keep that in mind, that the main character of the story that you're trying to interpret and preach may not be the sheriff with the white hat that rides into town and kills all the good guys. The story may be actually centered around the bad guy and what happens to him. Just keep that in mind. Whoever the primary character is, it's the person involved in this main plot. Are you following me so far? That's what you have to remember about the primary character. So regardless of his spirituality or morality, the protagonist is the central character experiencing the main action of the plot. Now, if you have your Bibles, let's take a look at Exodus 17 and put this to the test. Exodus 17, verses 1 through 7 is a story that takes place during the wilderness wanderings. The people of Israel have left Egypt, have gone through the Red Sea. In 14, in 15, you have the song of Moses, the bread from heaven, manna and water, the bitter water, then the manna from heaven. Then in 17, we read this, starting in verse 1. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" All right? So let's examine this really quick in light of the people. There are several people that are mentioned in this story. Who are they? Moses is a character. Who else? The Israelites. Those are the two primary human characters in the story, but then God also appears. Is there anybody else mentioned? The elders. So we have quite a bunch of characters, right? The Israelites, Moses, elders, and of course God. And so, first thing you ask, and we haven't even gotten to plot yet, but we have to talk a little bit about plot to talk about the characters. What's the problem in the plot? What's the problem? Very simple. Thirst, right? So the conflict that emerges, everything, again, the story starts off with this they're camping, they get to this place, they get to the next place, and then the conflict is introduced. There was no water for the people to drink. So conflict is introduced, right? And so then Moses goes through all this stuff, talks to God. God says something. What does he say? How is the problem resolved? How is the problem of thirst resolved? Moses strikes the rock, right? And water comes out of it. So the climax is striking of the rock, right? And the resolution is they drink and everybody's happy again until the next complaint. That's essentially the story. It's not much more complicated than that. Really, I think. Thirsty, problem. Solution. Moses hits the rock. They drink. All is good. That's the storyline. So, who are the people that go through the main problem and solution of the plot? The Israelites. Moses is not thirsty. He may be, but the narrator doesn't tell us that. Who are the ones that have to go through this the problem and solution? It's the Israelites. Do you see? So the main character is a group of people. It's the Israelites. And the change that occurs as a result of this journey. They go on. There's a problem of thirst. The Israelites are thirsty. They complain. Then problem ensues to a climax. Moses strikes the rock. Water comes out of it. Then they're all happy. So main characters here. Okay? So that's the first thing you want to do is look for the protagonist. Not necessarily the good guys, right? In this case, Are they good? Not at all. In fact, as I'll explain more as we explore the story, you'll see that they're actually pretty bad, what they do. This is not an ordinary complaint. This is not, let me have the remote control this hour. This is something very serious actually that's happening, as we'll see. So that's the main character. But secondly, there's an antagonist in most stories. So there's a protagonist, but there's also an antagonist. It's the primary character that opposes the protagonist. And in this journey, there's a protagonist, but then there's something that's going to hinder or some sort of obstacle that will keep the protagonist from completing this journey. This hero figure from accomplishing what he needs to accomplish. This oftentimes villain figure can be an individual or a group. Think, for example, in the New Testament of like the Pharisees. It could be personal or impersonal. For example, in the New Testament again, in Mark chapter 4, Jesus encounters the storm. That's a problem. That's an antagonizing problem, the storm. So it could be an impersonal force of nature, like the storm. So it could be personal, it could be impersonal. But no matter what, where, who or what it is, the antagonist is often inextricably linked to the conflict that poses a threat or obstacle to the protagonist. In this case, who is the antagonist? That's right. Moses and actually God. Because they're the ones that the people of Israel blame Moses. Why did you lead us out of Egypt to die of thirst in the desert? So you're the problem for my lack of thirst. You and the God you represent. Are you following? Now that's crazy if you think about it. How can Moses and God be the bad guy? And that's the irony of this story, as you'll soon see, and the beauty of this story. What the Israelites fail to see is they're the actual bad guys. But it's their story that's driving the truth. Do you see? God could have easily told the story through the perspective of Moses. But he doesn't. Because he wants to teach us something. Are we like the Israelites? Very interesting. And so that's why this story is told in this way. That's the beauty of literature and story that we need to see and examine. So you have the protagonist, you have the antagonist. And then third, there's the supporting cast, oftentimes in story, right? In good dramas, you have the hero figure, Harry Potter. You have the antagonist, Draco Malfoy. No, it's he who shall not be named. Lord Voldemort, right, is the antagonist and all that he represents. But then you have this wonderful supporting cast. For Frodo, it's his friends, it's the elves, it's Gandalf, whatever. In Harry Potter, you have his friends, primarily Hermione and Ron, but also the teachers, etc. So you have the supporting cast that also lend more color to the story. Who are the supporting cast in the story? The elders. So when supporting characters are mentioned in the narrative, you have to pay attention and ask the question, why did the narrator put them there? For what purpose? And this is all part of your interpretive process. And so when you examine Old Testament narratives, one of the first things you need to do, examine the people. Okay? So three main people, the last characters in the story. So the elders here. And we'll talk about why they're important in just a little bit. Secondly, let me finish this off. I alluded to this. Why is the study of the people in the story so important? Because they teach us two primary things. Studying the characters teach us something about ourselves usually, and teach us something about God. Analyzing the characters found in biblical Hebrew narratives primarily is important. It's because through the characters, we learn something about ourselves and we learn about God. First, about ourselves. Characters function in teaching us about ourselves because it's the way the narrator, it's the primary way the narrator wants to connect truths from the story to us as the reader. It's usually through the characters. The narrator wants you as a reader to identify, not only emotionally, but even rationally, identify yourself with characters in the story. The main truths of the story are often linked to the changes that occur to the characters as they go through the plot, as it develops from problem to solution. So that's the first thing to remember. You analyze characters because it's usually through the characters that's the link to you and to your hearers. But the second thing is through the characters you also primarily learn about God, about who He is, His character, His nature, the way He works. Characters serve the function, secondly, about teaching us something about some aspect of God, usually within the context of the history of redemption. So if the premise is true, that the whole Bible is a story of redemption, of God saving a people for Himself through the person and work of Jesus, then the characters, usually the characters of the stories, teach us something about God's desire to save us some way, redemptively. So our connection to the gospel, to the redemptive storyline, is usually found in the characters of the Old Testament. Not always, but usually. And so that's why we analyze the characters of the story, to not only connect with our hearers, but also to connect with God. Let me explain now. Exodus 17. One of the first things we learn about the people of Israel is that they make a complaint, verse 2, right? They quarreled with Moses. Now that word quarrel is a very unique word in Hebrew. It's not your ordinary run-of-the-mill arguing over something that's kind of trite or commonplace. This is the Hebrew word that is usually referred in the Old Testament to a lawsuit in a law court venue. It literally means the people of Israel brought a suit against Moses and the Lord. You see, this drama that's unfolding in this courtroom, it's this you have to almost picture it as a desert courtroom where the people of Israel are the plaintiffs bringing a charge against Moses and God. That's the word quarrel there. It's used elsewhere in the prophets when God brings a lawsuit against Israel for their sin. And so what's happening here is it's kind of like this justice system, law court venue. This is how serious this drama is. This isn't just, Moses, I'm thirsty. How come you don't have enough Gatorade for all of us? This is, Moses, I'm sick and I'm tired of trusting you and trusting God. Here we are in the desert, right? You've brought us here not only for us to die, but our livestock and our children and our livestock. My family and my finances are in jeopardy because I trusted you. Look at our situation. Look at our circumstances here. Look all around us. We're about to die. You know what? Forget this. I want a divorce. That's essentially what's happening here. The people of Israel had been pushed, in their mind, had been pushed too far. You took us out of Egypt. We had all the milk, all the honey, and now here we are. Look at our situation. And so they quarrel against Moses. In verse 4, another clue that helps us into what's happening here. Moses is afraid of stoning. That's not the normal way you deal with conflict in the Old Testament. Stoning was a specific punishment for breach of a contract. So Moses is now afraid of a punishment that's judicial, not an argument. So Moses is afraid of this judicial sentencing of death by breaking a contractual promise. Do you see what's happening here? And so what is the author trying to teach us through here? He's saying, look at the Israelites, readers of Exodus 17, those who want to interpret this and preach this and teach this. What does this say about our hearts? How many of us, when we go through the desert situations of our lives, when we look all around us and our family, our finances are not going the way we thought they would? Why are bad things happening to good people? I go to church, I pray, I try to raise my family well. Why is this happening to me? And in those moments, our hearts are what? Our hearts are tempted to what? Sow seeds of doubt which come out as what? Rejection and rebellion. And so for these Israelites, their doubt leads to utter rejection of God and said, we're done. We want out of this relationship. We don't want you anymore to run our lives. And what we're called to do is to see that and then make the connection and apply that to our people and say, friends, do you ever feel like that? When a loved one has died and you cannot explain. When all that you've worked for is taken away by the economy. How many of you face that temptation where your doubt leads to basically asking the question at the end of this passage, Lord, are you among us or not? See, it's through the characters and what they go through that we're called upon to examine and analyze and say, this is what the Israelites are facing. This is their trial. This is their temptation. And this is the result. Are we any different? And that's what Brian Chappell in his excellent book, Christ-Centered Preaching, calls the fallen condition focus. And Dr. Robertson will talk more about the fallen condition focus in his lecture. But part of our job is to find, through the main characters of the story, what is that fallen condition focus? And here, it's that sin, right? It's that doubt that leads to sin. Jeremiah was right, wasn't he, when he said our hearts are so fickle and deceitful, who can know it? At the first sign of trouble, the Israelites doubt and they reject their relationship with God. But are we any different? So now there's tension. There's tension in the story, right? Wow, this is a lot more serious. And that's how I would preach it. I would preach it, and that would really be my first point. I'll talk about the Israelites and what they're facing. What are the circumstances? They get thirsty, which is very natural in the desert. It's a Sinai Peninsula. But even in the midst of that thirst, they doubt. And it leads to rejection. And so now let's take a look at the plot. So the first thing you look at is the people in the narrative. The second thing you do is look at the plot. We've already talked a little bit about the plot, but let's break it down a little bit further. Plot is probably the best outline to talk about plot is what Aristotle said about good stories. He was brilliant. You know Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Even to this day, many people read Aristotle to understand the meaning of life. He basically said poignantly, wait for this, he said stories are good because they have a beginning, middle, and end. Yes, beginning, middle, and end. And let's use Aristotle's brilliant description of narrative to talk about plot. Most Hebrew narratives, when you analyze the stories in the Old Testament, look at the beginning. Most beginnings of the story will always set you up with some semblance of what the Hebrew Bible calls shalom. Some sense of well-being, some sense where everything is okay in the world. But they does that on purpose to kind of set you up. Everything is good, all is well, but you need to explain why all is well. You need to try to see what brought them to that point where all is well. In this story, in Exodus 17, think about it. Is this the first time they were thirsty? No. A couple chapters before, they were thirsty. They came upon bitter water. Remember, the water was very bitter to the taste. So Moses throws in a log, and the water becomes sweet to drink, and they drink. Interesting. So they've already experienced that. Is this the first time they've ever been hungry? No. They were hungry, and God miraculously opens up the sky and gives them manna from heaven, quail and manna from heaven, and double fold on Saturday so they don't have to work on the Sabbath. Amazing. So they've been thirsty before, they've been hungry before. So there's some semblance of peace. They've already experienced the power and provision of God, haven't they? And so that's something to recognize as you're examining the story, is what's happening here that led them to this qualified element of peace. So there is peace, but is there? Is there peace in their heart? Is there even peace in the land? Remember, this is during their wilderness wanderings. They don't even have a home. They're going to the promised land, their future home, the promised hope. But it's in the midst of this journey, this wilderness journey, that God wants to test their faith. So is there even peace? Well, there's some semblance of peace. But this is kind of the background that the narrator wants you to remember when you're thinking about the beginning of a story. But stories have some semblance of well-being and peace. It starts that way, right? They moved out. The congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of, and by the way, that's just a place. It doesn't mean literal sin. According to stages, And they camped at Rephidim. Excellent. He's just telling you that they're moving along in their journey. That's wonderful. How pastoral and great. Then boom, in comes the conflict, right? But, conjunction, junction, what's your function, right? But there was no water for the people to drink. And then comes the conflict. And that begins the second stage of a story, what we call the middle stage of the story. And whereas the beginning stage of a Hebrew story is characterized by this semblance of peace that has some factors that you need to be aware of, this introduction of this conflict then starts the beginning of the story where there needs to be some sort of resolution. And then along the way, along the middle of the story, further complications ensue. So you have to be aware of that. So it's not a quick and easy solution. It seems quick and easy on this, doesn't it? There was no water. Moses cries out, God, what should I do? God says, strike the rock. That seems like a pretty quick journey to the climax. But along the way, there are several details that are mentioned by the narrative. And as I'll tell you in just a little bit when we get to the particulars of Hebrew narratives are often very sparse in details. Hebrew narrative is characterized by very simple ways of describing the scene and describing different elements of the story. Unlike modern narratives, unlike modern novels that spend a lot of time giving you details, both psychological and external, both internal and external details of the character, their motivations, their intentions, of the setting and things like that, all the details of the table and what the mug felt like as it warmed my hand by the fire. A lot of modern novels have those details. Hebrew narrative is very sparse, which means when details are given, you're supposed to pay attention. And the details given in this stage of the middle part of the drama here are details like, take with you some of the elders of Israel. Remember the supporting cast? Why are they there? Examine that in the middle part of the narrative. And also, take in your hand your staff. That doesn't stop there. But it goes, with which you struck the Nile. Why does God go out of his way to mention that little qualifying clause? Take in your hand the staff, not take in your hand your sack. He didn't say take in your hand your boots to throw it at them. Take off your belt to whip them. He said take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile. So that forces you, as you're examining the middle part of the narrative, why the elders and why this staff? And why the staff of that older story when they were in Egypt? So what you realize when you examine that are these things. At least this is what I examined, and this is what I found. In Exodus 17, the elders oftentimes are necessary because of the legal formality of the situation. This further underscores that this is no ordinary drama. This is a very serious law case that's happening. And so the elders are present to ensure that justice will be reached. You see? But secondly, the staff. Very unique. It's a very unique staff that not only helped Moses walk, but represented the justice and judgment of God himself. When Moses struck the Nile River, turning it into blood, it was a strike of what? Judgment against Pharaoh and his disobedience and sin. Turning their life water, the Nile, into blood, into death. You see? It was a strike of death because of his disobedience. Now God says, take that staff, the one you used to judge Pharaoh against his sin with the judgment of death. Use that one and strike the rock. What does that mean? But you're getting closer to the solution, aren't you? So the conflict, there's all these complications along the middle part of the narrative. And you're reaching up to the climax. And as we already examined before, the climax is water coming out, right? But for the water to come out, the rod needs to hit the staff. The staff needs to hit the rock. But God says something very unique in verse 16 that you have to pay attention to. Again, these are these little details that you pay attention to when you're examining the plot. In verse 6, he says, behold. And again, dialogue is another place where Hebrew narrators force you to pay careful attention. These are some of the particulars of Hebrew narrative. He says, pass on, taking the staff. Verse 6, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. And there you shall strike the rock. So God says certain things that seem almost insignificant, doesn't it? Before he says strike the rock. I will go before and I will stand on the rock. And because you did your careful study of ancient Hebrew law court systems, you'll know that it's always in Hebrew narratives, guess who goes before the judge? The defendant, or the one who's about to receive the sentencing. God declares, I will go before. He places himself in the position of the defendant. And then he says, I will stand on the rock. Now, some of your Bibles may say by the rock, which is a fair translation of that Hebrew preposition. But I think here it's better translated on. The ESV, NAS, all translate that as on. You could be on or by, but I think on makes much more sense. And it should make sense to you. Because what is God saying? Is I will symbolically identify myself with that rock. That shouldn't sound so crazy to you, because we even sang songs in our Sunday school. There is no God, there's no rock like our God, right? There's that song. God being our rock, our sure foundation, our strong fortress. Throughout the scriptures, God is called the rock. In Psalms and Deuteronomy. What's interesting is if you just do a quick search of God being referred to as rock, he's not only has this connotation of being this solid foundation, but another thing you determine is that he's also a rock who fathered us, is a language. A rock who saved us. A rock who redeemed us. And so rock has more than just this kind of foundational, strong, secure connotation. It also has this connotation of salvation, redemption, rescue, birth-giving, life-giving. And so God says, I am the rock, I am the defendant. What's going on here? As we're about to approach the climax, what's happening? God is fully aware, as is Moses, that the punishment for a breach of contract, right? They want to go to court? Let's go to court. So they go to court. The charge has been filed. Treason. Failure to uphold the covenant. I will be your God. You will be my people. I will multiply you as the sands of the seashore, given to their great-great-grandfather Abraham. So they bring I see a lot of sand around me, Moses. But I don't think we're going to live. I want out of this relationship. All right, let's go to court. See who is truly the guilty party. Has God been unfaithful up to this point? Of course not. Time and time again in the wilderness wanderings, God has tested their faith and along the way provided extraordinary miracles to show. Perhaps the greatest miracle of all was not the manna and quail, not the bitter water turned wine, but the Red Sea event itself. Here they stood questioning God's faithfulness and saying, we don't trust you anymore. And they're like, Moses, did you just forget what happened? As you were fleeing from Pharaoh and these soldiers, God miraculously opens up the Red Sea. And close to 2 million of us, 2 million of us crossed untouched, unhurt. And as the last Israelite stepped up on the opposite shore and Moses brought his hands down, the Lord, with a mighty roar of his waves, crushes and kills Pharaohs and the Egyptians. And there they stood, the Israelites, hearing the cries of the soldiers, seeing with their eyes the dead wash up on the shore, tasting the victory of the Lord. Tangibly, God has demonstrated his faithfulness. And yet, at the first sign of trouble, they doubt and they want out of the relationship. So what does God do? Somebody needs to be punished for their sin. But whose sin is it? Did God sin? Did God break the contract? Of course not. The people of Israel, in their foolishness, don't even see that they're the ones that have sinned, broken the contract, and have doubted their Lord. Be my people, trust me, and obey me. And they said, no, thank you. We don't want to trust you. We don't want to obey you. And so what's the punishment for treason? Death by stoning. The rock Stoning, see the connections? The punishment for treason is stoning. And so what does God do? God must be stoned on behalf of his people so his people may live and for his promises to continue. God made a promise that the Messiah would come from the Israelites, that they would get to the promised land, and from then Jesus would come. How is that going to happen with this unfaithful, sinful people like you and for me? We can't do it. God must come. God must do it. So God says, I will go before. I'll stand on the rock. Stone me. Use the staff which was used to judge and kill the Nile. Kill me instead. Now do you see the climax? Now do you see how the gospel is ultimately found usually in the climax of the story? And that's why Paul can say so poignantly, and I can imagine him thinking about Exodus 17 as he's writing to this church in Corinth that is struggling with division, trials, tribulations, wanting to turn away from God. Corinthians, don't you know? Do you remember the story of the Israelites when they came upon the rock? Friends, that rock was Christ. And so this is doing justice to the narrative as it was originally given by the original author, but then also doing justice to God and his intentions in the gospel. And this is how you bring it together. And this is how you turn it. See, God takes the punishment. By his stripes we are healed. You see any other connections in the gospel? When Jesus on the cross, about to die, and the soldier has to check whether or not he truly is dead, throws a spear into his side. And what pours out of his side? Blood and water. In Revelation 22, the great throne room, and there sitting on the throne, the great Lamb of God, and what flows from his throne? The what of life? The river of life. In John 7, Jesus stands up at the great feast and says, those who are thirsty, come to me and drink, for you will thirst no more. These are not coincidences of Scripture, in my opinion. When there's a master artist, a master novelist, a master writer, our Creator God, our Redeemer God, he puts all these stories in the Bible to teach us something about the gospel, about us, to change us, who, like the fickle Israelites, so often doubt the Lord. And in our doubt, God must rescue because we cannot. And so, friends, when you go through those kinds of life circumstances, those desert times of life, where your family and your finances are in such jeopardy that you're tempted to question God, what are you called to do? To look to Jesus, to the Rock of Ages, who was cleft for you, and keep trusting and believing and drinking from his river of life. Because only through Jesus will you have the strength to keep walking in your journey, your pilgrim journey. Because you know this is not your home. You're just living in tents in the wilderness. But there's a mansion waiting for you. So keep going. Don't give up. Don't doubt. Keep going, because you have a God who's leading you. He not only leads you on this journey, but has died for you and has been raised from the dead to give you his water of life. So drink deep. Drink deep from his grace. Drink deep from his love. Drink deep from all that he provides. Now I'm preaching. I'm sorry. I'm a preacher. I want to preach. Isn't it good? Isn't this good? And this all from a lecture on the Old Testament narratives. So this is what, then the resolution. Let me finish off. There's actually something I got to finish. There's resolution to the plot. And then they drink. And again, there's some more details. And as the narrator is finishing up his story, pay attention to some of those details. And he called the place Massa and Meribah. Whenever the narrator includes place names, and we're going to talk about that, right, with those people, plot, places. I'm already jumping ahead of myself in the lecture. Whenever he mentions place names, he's assuming that readers they know the geography, the topography of the land. So when I said, it's kind of like the distance between Augusta and Atlanta, you would all go, oh, okay, I get it. For me in San Diego, I have no clue. Until I learned last night, as I was driving home from the airport, Pastor John told me that it's about a 2-hour drive, but it could be up to 4, depending on Atlanta traffic, right? So all of you kind of, yeah, it depends on traffic. And so when you read a story that talks about Atlanta to Augusta, immediately that sends something in your mind. Similarly, in the Old Testament, when place names are given, readers are like, yeah, I get it. Your job is to figure out, I don't get it. What's with Massa and Meribah? That's your job to study the details of that text, because the narrator gives those details for a reason. Those are some of the details that makes the text so beautiful and unique. And that's your job, to balance the unique qualities of the text as well as the awesome message of the gospel, and bring it together and then apply it, and so that people would respond in the right ways. That balance of the original text by the original author, Christ in the text according to the divine author, and then bringing it to bear upon people's life. This kind of circle of interpretation and preaching is what you're trying to do. And so Massa and Meribah have certain place that has certain meaning that I don't have time to get into, because I need to move on to some of the other elements of Old Testament narrative. So okay, we looked at plot. We've looked at people, the characters in the story and why they're important. We've looked at the plot dynamics and why that's important for meaning as well as for preaching. Now let's look at the places. I alluded to this just recently, but another feature of biblical narrative that you need to pay careful attention to are the place names that are given in the story, if they're given. Hebrew narrators, do not often utilize descriptions of the physical surroundings or give you places of geographic setting. They oftentimes will not. So when they do, you must pay attention. Because this mention of specific places, landmarks, topography, water, all of that presupposes an understanding between the narrator and the reader. And so Israelite readers of the Old Testament would have known, for example, the distances between cities, features of the land, even during times of the year. For example, in Joshua chapter 3 and 4, then the Israelites finally are almost at the promised land. All they have to do is cross the Jordan River. And this is kind of like the second Exodus narrative, where the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant step into the Jordan, and then the Jordan opens up, and then they cross. And you think, what's the big deal? It's just a little river. Actually, it's not. If you know the details of the narrative, that he actually says it's at this place, at this time of year, which would have been flood season. And so this is not a little trickling brook, oh, not lovely, da, 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 da. This is like a raging Category 5 whitewater rafting death river. Not unlike what the Israelites faced at the Red Sea. So this is the second Exodus, so to speak, before they enter the Promised Land. So those are the little details you have to keep in mind. Another place where this becomes important, Jonah. The first, all of you know the story of Jonah, right? But if you don't listen to the little place name details, if you go to the first couple of verses, Jonah is told very simply, go to Nineveh. He's in Samaria, he's in northern Israel. Go to Nineveh, which is, so he's in Israel, and he's told to go to Nineveh. So he's in Israel, and he's told to go to Nineveh. You know, Israel's like that. There's the Mediterranean Sea. Guess which direction Nineveh is? It's actually northeast. Okay? That's Nineveh. The narrator goes out of his way to say that he went to Tarshish, right? He says he went down to Tarshish, to Joppa. Guess which direction that is? Just guess. It's exactly the opposite way. And so when the narrator gives you those kind of details, you go, oh, why is he mentioning those cities? See, so the readers of that would have known immediately, it just shows his disobedience. It's literally 180 degrees. So those are the little things that make the text unique and come alive, add color. So do you want to preach in black and white or in color? HD, 1080p. That's what you want to preach in. That's what you want to do. This is what it takes. So come to Westminster Seminary and I'll teach you some of this. Kind of kidding, but not really. Fourth, not only people, places, people, plot, places, the last one are particulars. You also want to look at particulars in the narration. There are three particular elements of Hebrew narrative that you want to take a look at. The particularities of omission, repetition, and dialogue. Again, there are many more features to Old Testament narrative, but these are the main ones that will be helpful for you. Omission. As I mentioned before, a particular feature often found in narrative texts in the Old Testament is actually the omission of details. Biblical narratives omit the kind of details that modern novels will dwell upon. So simply put, when the narrator goes out of his way to mention details, especially the inner workings of the character's mind, pay careful attention. Because he's emphasizing, by including the detail, he's saying, pay careful attention to what I'm saying here, because I'm using this as a clue to help you with meaning. Furthermore, omission, repetition. Another feature of Hebrew narrative that deserves analysis is the use of repetition. There are fancy words for this, like Leitwort in German, but essentially when the Hebrew narrator uses certain Hebrew words in different ways, but it's essentially the same character or same kind of word, signifies something. For example, Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Jonah is told to go to Nineveh. Okay? But not only goes this way, down to Joppa, but the verb used to signify his movement is the verb to go down. And interestingly, in these 4 or 5 verses, not a lot of verses, the narrator goes out of his way to use this verb many times. He went down. So he went down to Joppa, where he found a ship. He went down onto the ship, not the normal word used to say he went aboard the ship. He went down to Joppa. He went down on the ship. And then he went down to the lower decks to sleep, remember? And then he went into the water, and then he went down into the sea to the belly of the fish. What is the narrator trying to signify to you with this use of repetition? That's the cycle of disobedience and sin. It's a cycle of disobedience. It's just going down and further down. When you run away from the Lord and you disobey his calling, you're just going to go down this. You're just going to be in this cycle of sin. Is that what the narrator is trying to tell you? So a little simple thing like repetition, you pick up on, you go, oh yeah, I remember Dr. Kim said, pay attention to repetition in the Hebrew. Oh, what does that mean? The narrator is trying to tell me something. So omission, repetition, dialogue. The use of dialogue by the narrators of biblical stories is another particular literary feature to help you. And so especially when the narrator wants to clue you in on the motives of the characters, the kind of the inner psychological ruminations of the characters, he usually uses dialogue to get at that. And so when dialogue is present in a narrative, pay careful attention. I've probably said pay careful attention to 20 things, haven't I? Sorry. That's how rich the Word of God is, So rich. So pay attention to it all. But there's priority. And again, what I'm trying to say is as you look at all of these particularities, these particulars, as well as the places and the plot and the people, ultimately you're trying to drive at what's the meaning. What is the meaning of the original author given to the original readers, the Israelites? What is he trying to communicate to the Israelites that first heard the story, read the story? And then after that, you're trying to figure out, in light of the divine author, what is God trying to say about Jesus and us in light of the story? And then from there, you make the next move, interpretive move. In light of what the original author had in mind for the original hearers, in light of what God has in mind through the gospel and Jesus to us, how do I then apply it to my unique place and time, to my unique people? And that'll differ from Augusta to San Diego, because we have different needs, different concerns. And that's part of the pastoral discernment and wisdom that's needed to really preach to people, to shepherd people, real life people. And that's more of an art than a science, isn't it? So preaching is an art and a science. That's what makes it so beautiful. And so for me, part of my goal is to always preach and design sermons according to truth, goodness, and beauty. What is the truth of the text according to the original and human authors? How is it good for my people? And that's ultimately only through the gospel. Truth, goodness, and then how can I present it in a way that stirs their souls as well as moves their head? So I want to preach sermons that are true, good, and beautiful. And if you know this language, this is a language of classic rhetoric. But anyway, and so let me show you one last, I've got more, but let me just show this and then we can stop. A PowerPoint that kind of explains a little bit of this. It's called the Clowny rectangle. This is the kind of the hermeneutical movement that I've just made, meaning the interpretive movement. So when you're faced with an Old Testament symbol, that's bottom left is the S. That symbol can be the rock. It could be characters. It could be an event, an institution, a person. Whatever that symbol is that you're trying to figure out, which is the main part of the story, you go through what I would call the first layer of interpretation, which includes linguistic analysis, literary analysis, and life setting analysis. The only thing that I've covered thus far primarily is literary analysis, namely the genre of the narrative arc. I didn't talk about Hebrew semantics, Hebrew structure, Hebrew verbs. That's all linguistic study. All that to say, you determine T1. T1 is truth symbolized, or what's the primary truth of that story as given by the original author to the original audience. And so for the Israelites, in Exodus 17, that story based on the narrative arc, because based on the primary problem and solution, that's another parameter. The gentleman back there asked about how do we keep ourselves from not preaching Christ from every rock? What keeps me in check is how is that story given according to the rules of Hebrew narrative? Not only to the people, the plot, the places, and the particulars. So those are the things that keep me in check. And it's usually the primary solution to the problem. So in Exodus 17, the primary problem was the problem of thirst, and then hitting the rock was the primary solution. And so how do we determine meaning from that? For the Israelites, they learned from that what? That God can be trusted because he saved them from death of thirst, right? Because God saved them from the death because of thirst through the provision of water from the rock, they are now called upon to trust him and obey him, right? That's essentially the story, Exodus 17. That's the thesis of Exodus 17. Now, that's only T1. That's truth. That's truth to the first power, or truth according to the original author to the original audience. Now, you also then want to do justice to the gospel, to the history of redemption. Now, this is where you take that truth, as I just explained it, carry it over time through history, and find culmination in the person and work of Jesus. That's truth to the nth degree, to the fulfillment of that story in Jesus. So how do we find Jesus in this story? Well, this one's easy because Paul tells us that that rock was Christ. So for us, what does that mean for application? The last movement, you go from S to T1, then from T1 to Tn, T to the nth power, then Tn to application. What does that mean for us? Instead of, because God saved them from death of thirst through the rock that was cut so that they can trust him. For us, what's the gospel truth? Because Jesus was split in half for us. And through his life, death, and resurrection, we are saved from death, from our sin. We should trust and obey him. Do you see? My thesis undergoes this kind of shift, a gospel shift, because of that history of redemption interpretive move. That movement around the box is called typology. It's called typological interpretation, where a symbol undergoes analogy as well as escalation to find meaning in the gospel for us. Does that make sense? See, you see the white line that goes from T1 to A is moralism? That's basically leaving Jesus out of the sermon or the interpretation. That's basically saying, trust, obey without Jesus. Do you see? That's how the rabbi would preach it in the Old Testament, in the synagogue. Think about it. The rabbi has access to Exodus 17. How would he teach it to his Jewish congregation? He would tell the same story. Isn't our God good? He saved our forefathers from thirst in the desert. Don't be like them. Don't distrust God. Work harder. Isn't that essentially the message? Try harder. Don't sin. Shame on you. And in fact, that's my application for today. 3 words. Shame, shame, shame. But at the end of the day, what is that? That's law, not gospel. That's something what you must do, not something that has been done. And so what we must do flows out of what was already done. That's the difference. Once you preach the gospel and say, Jesus did this for you now, through the power of the gospel, through the power of the resurrection blood and water that flows through your veins, when you go through those desert circumstances, trust, obey, work hard, not because somehow God will accept you, but because you're so thankful, because you love Him, because you marvel at His, you wonder at the gospel, and you're so captivated and gripped by the beauty of Jesus, you want to obey, you want to follow. Not that you're going to be perfect. So what will motivate Christians, not Jews, what will motivate Christians? The gospel. So the gospel is about Christ's penalty-paying work, His power-providing work, and His passion-producing work. You like that? That's in the book too. So you have to buy the book. So Christ is penalty payer. Christ is power provider. There's also another one. Christ is probation preserver, meaning He kept the law for you in your place. And He's also the passion producer. And all of those different aspects of Christ's grace. And so Chapel talks about the same thing. It's grace-infused preaching. It's the grace of the gospel. It's Jesus-infused preaching. So that's how I approach Old Testament Hebrew narratives. And that's how I try to interpret it and preach it. And I hope this has been helpful for you in some way.